Hello, everyone. I just want to take a look at a couple of remarks from the week two discussion board on Thomas Nagel. Something that I think highlights an important element, not everything from Nagel that you have to understand, but an important element that I think is there. This is from Joshua, who said Nagel brings up that death can sometimes, not all the time, be bad, and that means bad for the person who dies. Against what Epicurus said, right? His motive for this is that to some, the taking away of the ability to experience the pleasures in life is ultimately bad for the person who has undergone death. That is, death is bad, Nagel says, because it's a loss of goods. It's not what he calls a positive bad. It's not suffering, it's not pain, it's not unhappiness, because he accepts the Epicurean idea that we become nothing at death. However, although it's not a positive bad, it's not suffering and pain, it is a loss of goods and is a bad insofar as it is loss of goods. That brings up certain problems, but Joshua continues to put this in a more intangible sense. He uses the example of a person who has undergone a neurological trauma that made it so that their brain reverts back to infancy. Since the person cannot cognitively be aware that his brain has reverted, the question becomes, was there a bad that happened? This is good. Josh is doing, showing that this is an analogy with death. That is, what Nagel is trying to show is that even if the person who to whom the loss has happened is not aware of the loss, it still is a bad for them. Right? So a person who has suffered this traumatic brain injury and is not aware of the loss of capacity that they've undergone, that we would still say something bad has happened to them, even if they're not aware of it and are not suffering because of it. That, of course, is analogous with the position of the person who's died. They obviously are not suffering. They're not aware of the loss. Yet we would say that something bad happened to the person. It's supposed to be an example of being able to say that something bad has happened to someone, even if they're not aware of it. Nagel would argue, yes, something bad happened due to the loss of the potential to experience life's pleasures. Yeah, I think that's right. My question is can death be a good? If by Nagel's sense a person who loses the ability to be aware of the good in life is being harmed, that's true, then what of a person who is suffering in life? If death stops a person from being aware of their suffering, then can death be considered good? And would Nagel agree? Well, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, all that Nagel is trying to prove in his essay is that sometimes, as Joshua correctly says, sometimes death is a bad for the one who dies. And of course, that leaves open the possibility that sometimes it's not. And then the question is, what would the conditions be under which somebody's death would not be a bad for them? This is Julia who followed up on Joshua's remark. He said, I think Nagel would agree that death can be a good thing. As he mentions, time must be considered when trying to say if one's death is considered bad in this sense. When taking people's past and future into consideration, that means some deaths would be considered bad if there was an immense loss of experience. But they can also be considered good if someone was suffering and wouldn't have been able to experience much anyway. Um, I think that the way that I think this is good, that this points out that whether somebody's death can be considered a bad for them, it really depends upon what they would have experienced had they not died when they did. Maybe, uh, maybe just very quickly drawing a little thing you'll become familiar with would help. If we say, I don't know, this is the time before somebody's born, and then, oh no, this is the time when they're alive, and then there's death, and then there's May not help too much, but I'll draw it anyway. If we look at this little line, and you'll see that these lines will become more and more prominent in the next week. If we look at that dotted line and with that slash in the middle, if the slash is death, the event of death, and everything before is life, and everything after is what we would have experienced had we not died at the time that we did. Whether somebody's death is considered bad or not is whether or not that experience that was taken away by death actually contained goods. Um, if that experience did not contain goods or a prevalence of goods over bad, then there's no reason for, on Nagel's terms, for calling somebody's death bad. The whole reason that he gives for calling somebody's death a bad for them, for the one who dies, is that the experience they otherwise would have had, had they not died when they did, contains goods. And the death, therefore, is a loss of goods because it's a loss of all future experiences. And those future experiences, some of which at least would be goods. If we can imagine that when somebody dies, the future they would have had they not died when they did, contained nothing but bads, then there's no reason for calling their death a bad because there's no loss of goods. Now, if we want to go farther and say that their death is a good, because I think that's what Joshua was getting at, is that some people's future is very grim and contains maybe almost nothing but bads, so that their death might be considered a good. I don't think that I'm willing to go quite so far on Nagel's terms. The farthest I'm willing to go is to say that he leaves open the possibility that some people's deaths are not a bad for them. But that's I think different from saying that some people's deaths are a good for them. I think Joshua was thinking that they would have been a good for them because it would have been avoidance of future suffering, and avoidance of future suffering is good. I'm not willing to go that far on Nagel's terms. I don't think he proves that much. I think that what he tries to establish is that some people's deaths cannot be considered bads for them. But just because something is not a bad for you does not mean it's a good for you. It's obvious. But so it really, I don't know, it's a question that we would need to work out in more detail whether somebody's death could actually be considered a good for them. I'm not so sure. But clearly, Nagel leaves open the possibility that some people's deaths are not a bad for them because you could say with some degree of certainty that there's no goods in their future. And if there's no goods in their future, then the taking away of future experiences cannot be a bad because there's no loss of goods.